Problems with Black Hebrew Israelite Theology by me. First, let us examine the view from the Black Hebrew Israelites' perspective from the earliest times of slavery. The Hebrew Israelite movement is rooted in Black Judaism, a belief system birthed in the late 1800s by Black Christians from the South, Pentecostal holiness movement. They claim to have received a revelation. America's recently emancipated slaves were God's chosen people, the true Hebrews. Although followers of Black Judaism thought of themselves as the descendants of 12 tribes of Israel, I take that to mean that, other people deserve condemnation or attack. One notable exception was F.S. Cherry. This is the first guy who was, a little unruly, to put it nicely, I guess. He was a self-declared prophet. That's pretty interesting in itself. Who in 1886 started a Black Jew church in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where he preached that white people were inherently evil and hated by God. Please remember what time this is in during 1886. I think it's ironic that he would come up with that conclusion. Wouldn't anybody? Anyway, Cherry also instructed his followers that the earth is square and that Jesus will return in the year 2000 to install blacks over whites through a race war. Please note that this was declared during a time where a kind of black versus white race war was still a very hot issue. The whites in the South wanted to keep slavery, and the whites in the North wanted to, quote unquote, free the slaves. I don't want to get into that. But what he said was basically during that time. Yet, we're to turn a blind eye to this influence. Please kind of think about what I just said. I'm going to go ahead and move on for the short remainder of this video. Some Africans were actually Jews and carried with them their faith. Other Africans who held on to their native religions were forced to adopt Christianity by their slave masters. From these two faiths sprung up Negro spirituals and biblical songs generation after generation. However, that's not all that sprung forth. Some Africans who held the Old Testament passages began to believe that the Jews of the Old Testament were actually the Africans shipped to the Americas. Even though the Bible clearly demonstrates what makes you a Jew, none of us would expect our ancestor slaves to be Bible scholars back then. And that's an important note. According to Black Judaism doctrine, when the kingdom of Israel was destroyed, the Israelites were first scattered across the African continent and then selectively targeted by enemy African tribes who captured and sold them to European slave traders for bondage in the New World. That's a heavy claim. Quote, "It's a common myth that slaves were randomly shackled up and carried off to slavery. Slave traders sailed for months and days to get specific pickup points. They knew what people they were taking, specifically the lost tribes of Israel." SUPK. I never knew, slave traders had a religious edge for picking out African Jews. Wouldn't it be less profitable for, slave traders to limit their hunt to black Jews? Didn't they hunt for maximum profit? I mean, that would just make perfect sense, unless, the, European slave traders are somehow religiously educated and religiously inclined. That's a far stretch if you actually look at what happened in history. So, is this actually consistent and true with actual history? Find out with one of their favorite books to use, From Babylon to Timbuktu. I decided to download this entire book in JPEG format. So I actually ripped out I basically went through almost a whole book to show you some things. So let's take a look at some passages from the book. In the year 1856, I repeat, in the year 1856, Dr. J. L. Wilson wrote his history of Western Africa. He transmits it to us the composites of religious culture of some of the inhabitants of Senegambia or Senegal and Guinea. In Senegal, he said, quote, "Complete medley of paganism, Judaism, and Mohammedanism, which is Islam." and it is difficult to say which of the three occupies the most prominent place or exerts the greatest influence upon the character of the people. However, the sentiment of the inhabitants regarding this multi-religious culture or mixture was that the combination of the three religions furthered the welfare of all. How do we rationalize and explain the medley of paganism, Judaism, and Islam near the ruins of the medieval Jewish kingdom of Commuria? So, clearly we have some problems with black Hebrew Israelite beliefs. The fact that the racial mixing of Israel with Africans. So if the promises attain to you according to race, if the race was a main factor, what would that mean? Would that mean half of the person, 3/4 of the person, 1/3 of the person? You see, when you accept one concept, you have to accept the consequences of what that concept brings along with it. Covenant is what makes you one of God's people. A Jew, Israelite, whatever you want to call it. There's one way to enter into God's covenant, which is circumcision. You cannot be born into the covenant that God laid down. This is why circumcision is found littered throughout the Bible, because it was a pivotal factor that converted you to becoming a part of God's people. However, it's noted that even the author of From Babylon to Timbuktu knows that conversion was just a normal part of Judaism. This is what made Judaism a faith and never a race. If so, there would be some serious problems with Judaism being a race. Problems like what? For one, consistency. God must be consistent in what he means and decrees because he is God. So, also Acts 15 and Esther 8:17 would contradict God's decree on what made you a Jew, if we believe what black Hebrew Israelites believe. Acts 15 is also called the Jerusalem Council, where Peter, Paul, and James argued together against the Jews who clearly claimed that Gentiles had to become Jews in order to receive salvation from Christ. Stop this video now and read it all for yourself. I really do encourage you. Esther 8:17, well, it's self-explanatory below. All in capital letters I put, and many of the people of the land became Jews. That's part of Esther chapter 8 verse 17. Please explain that. How do you become a Jew if, you're saying that your ancestors were, a race of Jews or single race of people? You can't become a race. So Judaism is not a race. The Jews are not a race. It's a faith. It's a people, united under a faith. Many peoples united under a faith. Functioning as one people. I don't have time to get in it. I'll have to dig this out later. Let's move on. Became Jews translates into Hebrew as Judaize. People Judaized by God's law of circumcision. Let's take a look. I'm not going to read all in white. I'm just going to read what's only in yellow. You can go ahead and read this whole thing for yourself, but I'm only going to read what's in yellow for the sake of time in this video. Every male child among you must be circumcised, and you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a sign or a token of the covenant between me and you. And the son of 8 days shall be circumcised among you, every male in your generation, he that is born in your house, or bought with silver from any son of a foreigner who is not of your seed. The child of your house and one purchased of your money, circumcising, must be circumcised. And my covenant shall be in your flesh for a perpetual covenant. And an uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, his soul shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. This was in Genesis, and this was basically the first Jew or Israelite, whatever you want to call it. You know who he was? Abraham. That's the beginning. That's what makes you a Jew. Notice that this is in Genesis, the beginning. Also, for a quick note on the women, if women wanted to become Israelites, this would be how to do it. I'm not going to read it, but you can go ahead and read it. All right, moving on. So you can see on Exodus chapter 4, verse 24 through 26, notice that we went from Genesis to Exodus. And so far the story has not changed. If you read above, Moses almost got killed from God. God almost cut Moses off by ending his life. Almost got his life ended because he did not choose to circumcise his son. So, chapters later, Moses made a decree from God, and it was the same decree from Genesis 17. Let's take a look. Once again, I'm really not going to read this whole thing, but I will read certain little passages. Let's start at the bottom here. It says, "And when a stranger shall sojourn with you, and will keep the Passover of the Lord, then let all his males be circumcised, and let him come near and keep it." Interesting language there. "And he shall be as one born in the land, for no uncircumcised person shall eat thereof. One law will be to him that is homeborn, and unto the stranger that sojourneth among you. This did all the children of Israel, as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, so did they." I don't know how much more clear that can get. Circumcision was basically the key factor. This becomes clear by the time of the New Testament. Once again, I encourage you guys to read Acts chapter 15. Let's go ahead and just get into it. I picked certain verses out. Verse 1, "Except ye be circumcised after the manner of Moses, ye cannot be saved." That's what the Jews were teaching when they came into the whole Christian doctrine that Paul, Peter, and James were all pushing. They thought, oh, okay, well, we see the salvation. Well, I guess they all have to be Jews to be saved. Does that sound familiar? That sound like black Hebrew Israelites? Yeah, it really does. Let's go to verse 9. "And put no difference between us and them, purifying their hearts by faith." Now, those are the disciples talking. These people that the disciples were speaking of were Gentiles. Us and them, right? Put no difference between the Jews and the Gentiles. And that does and has always meant non-Israelites. Here's some simple proof. If you look at this verse right here, I'm going to read the last half of that. It says that the residue of men might seek after the Lord, and that all the Gentiles, upon whom my name is called, saith the Lord, doth all these things. Peter quoted a prophecy from Amos 9:12. This was about the Edomites. But why weren't the Edomites mentioned? Because Peter was quoting from the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament. They quoted from the Septuagint all the time, not the Hebrew. Take a look for yourself. This is a program that I have. It's called the Lex versus the KJV. And you can see right here it is on the left. This is the Septuagint. It reads just as Peter had said it. And yet on the right, it reads how our Bible always says it, which is the Hebrew Masoretic text. You take another look here. Remnant of men, all the Gentiles. Remnant of Edom, all the heathen. It's pretty self-explanatory there. And yet he used this verse to describe the people he was calling Gentiles. Now, last time I checked, Edomites were not Israelites, until they were converted over. So if the Edomites were converted over during the time of the Maccabees, then these people that they're calling Gentiles were also going to be converted into Christians. This is consistent. Let's go to the next video.